So what we have now is 4 responses, and the first up is Lawrence Bond, who is the director of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission since May 2017, and before this he was the acting director and head of research for the Commission, and then obviously he was the head of research in the Then Equality Authority from 2002. So Lawrence, can I hand over to you to respond? And sorry, you're on mute there. Sorry,
yeah,
apologies.
right
yep.
there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. And Paul, good to see you again. Long time no see. And just to add my congratulations to Mary. Delighted to hear about the professorship. I'm on my phone because I need my notes on my computer. So apologies. Trying to work with these new systems. I suppose. Just want to thank, first of all, Mary Ann and Michelle for inviting me to participate in the discussion today. But I just want to clarify, I suppose, just at the outset, that the reflections that I'm presenting here are my own thoughts on reading their paper and thinking about it, rather than in any sense speaking on behalf of the Commission as such, just to put that in context. And I obviously want to congratulate Mary Ann and Michelle on the paper. And on getting the research to this point, I was very struck by Mary's comments at the beginning that this was a hard piece of research. And it was a bit of a hard read, Mary, a very useful read, but it was evident as well in reading it that the research was hard. And I'm very struck by the fact that it is a scoping study, and with a view, hopefully, to doing more work if that's possible. So I think that's a very important part of the mix. I mean, I think the paper is important because it's addressing important issues. And I think I suppose it's striking, and the paper itself makes this very clear. These aren't new issues. And certainly, you know, they've already been at the center of debates, if you like, on the ground for, I'd say, a couple of decades now in Ireland, and obviously for much longer in the international experience and literature. And so one of the things I think that's important about the paper is that it's theorizing and developing that debate and trying to bring it out into a broader space, because I think part of the difficulty of these issues is that they've been teased out, and a lot of the concerns that have been identified here would be familiar to people on the ground, but they haven't really hit as part of the public debate. And I think that this is important. I also think, obviously, the current context of a new government and, you know, a new context in Ireland is probably an important timing to be having this kind of debate, and the more it can be pushed out there, the better. And so these issues obviously were very important before COVID-19, but I do think we kind of have to take account of that experience of the last few months, because I do think one of the things it's done in a very important way is brought the issue of human services, which is what I described the area we're mainly talking about here, to center stage, at least for now, in an important way. And I think obviously COVID has done that, and you know, by on the one hand highlighting many strengths in terms of human services, obviously in terms of very dedicated and expert staff across a range of areas. Also, I have to say, you know, positive experiences in terms of responsiveness, ability to listen, ability to be agile and to move. So I think that that's been a positive sense of, you know, what the strengths we have in human services. But I think everybody would agree that the overriding sense that emerges from the COVID experience is it has highlighted weaknesses in the human service in general, in terms of their, I suppose, of their gaps, in terms of capacity, in terms of coherence and planning. So I think it has very much highlighted, and I suppose it's also highlighted the significance of human services, because one of the problems in the Irish context, I think, is that, and this obviously goes back to bigger questions about the particular development of our welfare state, but in many ways, human services are there, but they're sort of historically still very much in the charity model, and the centrality of them for the quality of our life and our society, and indeed our individual lives, is underestimated. You know, there's a tendency to think it's about other people, even though when you look at them in the round, they're about central parts of all our lives all the time. So I think that COVID context is very important, and I suppose the crucial message is trying to keep that human services and the centrality of human services at the center of the recovery and the need for reform and change in that respect. So I think the paper is raising very important, I'm conscious I better speed up, important questions about the provision of human services, obviously looking specifically at commissioning and procurement in 4 areas, which Mary has outlined. I won't go into them again, Mary and Anne, and obviously particularly its implication for civil society organizations. Now, in a sense, I'd be very conscious at this stage that probably everybody here in the webinar is closer to those issues on the ground than I am, and in some ways my comments are going to be relatively broad brush. But I do think that the significance of the issues that the paper is discussing only become clear when they're situated in a wider discussion. And I think this is implicit throughout the paper, it's everywhere, but it needs to be really drawn out much more fully. And I think it's crucial then that the starting point for that wider discussion is the service user rather than service provider. The focus of the paper is on the service provider, but obviously the intent is, what does this mean for the service user? And I think the central question there is, how do we ensure that the needs and rights of service users are actually driving the development and delivery of human services? And I think those issues are touched on throughout the paper, but that focus is not a central driver. I think the paper makes a very important contribution to that discussion, and particularly to how social inequality provisions can and must be embedded into commissioning and procurement. Now, in many ways, a lot of the detail that Anne was outlining there about the particular challenges there are precisely the kind of technical and details that have to be addressed if that's to become a reality. So it's not just about saying we'll equality and social vision into a document, but it's, what does that mean for your assumptions about the type of provider, the duration of provision, the flexibility to respond to need, and that. So I think that's very important. And I also obviously acknowledge the reference to the public sector equality and human rights duty, which potentially can have a role. I mean, we have to still work out what that role is. It's obviously, it's not a directly prescriptive duty, and so you have to use it in a certain way. But there's certainly a grounding in the duty to argue that public bodies in commissioning out services have to take account of equality of human rights in that. They can't simply put them out there without concern for that, at least in the light of the duty. But having said that, though, I suppose the main point I want to make is that it does seem to me that that discussion about how you embed equality and rights into commissioning has to be part of and underpinned by thinking about a broader regulatory framework for human services that incorporates equality and human rights. I do think we need to be framing this in the context of how do we have clarity of service standards that are rights-based and equality-based, and which are developed in an open, transparent and inclusive process, which in some sense, now these will differ obviously from service area to service area, but in some sense set out what it is we're trying to achieve, and that embed equality and rights into that in the first instance. And obviously to provide for robust independent inspection across all human services as a criterion. Because I think that to some extent, the issue about procurement itself is a means to an end, but if we haven't got coherence in place about what the end is we're trying to achieve in services, you may win certain battles or lose certain battles within particular procurement process, but it's quite hard to win the war. I suppose in relation to that question about what I call there the development of a rights-based regulatory state, I think it's important to say that obviously in part of the debate that's happened in Europe and Western world about these issues over the last 20, 30, 40 years, public regulation has been presented as a substitute for public provision. So it's been part of a project to say, well, we'll have regulation and then we'll marketize and regulate the market. But I think the issue of public regulation doesn't have to be about substituting public provision. It can complement public provision. And one of the important points in the paper that comes in slightly at the end, but I think is a hugely important paper, and Anne mentioned it in terms of the robust alternatives, which is that we do need actually a reaffirmation of the importance of public provision of services. And I think that has to be central. And I think it's important to take the opportunity of the change that is occurring in Ireland now, both politically and in terms of COVID, to really try and robustly reassert that.
I think Lawrence is frozen there. just give him another minute. But look, I think certainly he had an opportunity to maybe make the main points that he wanted to make, and I think they're well noted in terms of particularly the focus on the service user and the right-based focus that he was emphasizing within the and bringing coherence